Let's back up now a little bit and start thinking about planning. Although I've already talked about how to teach your first class and about the way in which a teacher needs to develop a consistent persona in his or her interactions with the students, I certainly don't want to give you the impression that you can just improvise from week to week. Before any teaching project begins, you need to think clearly about what will have happened by the time it ends. You need to be thinking about the end of the course even before the course begins. When the course is finished, what do you want the students to have learned? How do you intend to teach it to them? And what problems do you anticipate? What methods do you have for overcoming these problems? How are you going to break the material down into manageable units so that the students will be able to learn it and be able to learn according to the style of your discipline, your disposition of the classroom? Now, in teaching, there's always an element of surprise. Every now and again, things come up, surprising things come up. And even after 30 years of classroom teaching, things still happen in my classes that I've never seen before. One time I had a student who asked me if he could have 3 weeks off from the course. I objected very strongly, but he said he'd been invited to compete in the US National Chess Championships, and I was so overawed by this remark that I agreed at once. And when he came back, he'd won the whole thing. He was the United States National Chess Champion. I'm so glad I agreed. Another time, a student apologized for not coming to class, but said that he'd broken his neck skiing, and that he had to wear a brace that was actually screwed into his scalp. When he did come back, he was literally rigidified in this device, which prevented his head from moving, except at the same rate as his shoulders. But anyway, usually now, when a problem arises with my classes, I'm able to tell myself, oh yes, it's that kind of problem. I can put it in a familiar category of problem. In the early stages of anyone's teaching career, there are more surprises. Careful and methodical planning cuts down on the degree of uncertainty, and it helps give anxious teachers more confidence. And at first, nearly all teachers are anxious. On the other hand, you've got to be careful not to over-plan. Don't let yourself get rigidified into a straitjacket. Students ought not to feel that you've got a script so rigid that no deviations from it are permissible. All right, so planning. Before you begin teaching a course, you need to plan it carefully and to decide what it is that the students should take from it when it's ended. First of all, do you want the students to learn a body of knowledge, or do you want them to learn a new conceptual approach, or do you want them to learn a combination of those two things, which is perhaps the most common? Let me read to you from Wilbert McKeechee, the author of Teaching Tips. He says, the first step in preparing for a course is working out course objectives, because all the decisions involved in course planning should derive from your objectives. The objective of a course is not to cover a certain set of topics, but rather to facilitate student learning and thinking. In most courses, we're concerned about helping our students in a lifelong learning process. That is, we want to develop interest in further learning and provide a base of concepts and skills that will facilitate further learning and thinking. That's absolutely right. I fully endorse what he has to say there. Now, Steve Pollock and Jeanette Norden, two of the professors we met in the fall of 2009, reiterate the importance of these primary critical objectives: to develop student interest in the area, and then to provide the necessary foundational skills to facilitate their learning.
Planning a course depends, if it's a brand new course, the first thing you got to think about is learning goals. It's pretty easy to look at an established curriculum. You look at the syllabus that people have been using in the past. There's a lot of traditions in a physics department. But really, you need to go further than that. The list of topics, I think, is insufficient to start a course. I want to think about what is the population of students in this class. Are they engineers? Are they physics majors? Are they non-scientists? So that will help me to establish what I think are the appropriate goals for the course. And goals include content knowledge. They also include sort of meta content knowledge. I want my students, for instance, to develop problem-solving skills or the ability to communicate science. And articulating these, writing them down, thinking about them, maybe discussing them with colleagues is very, very helpful to me in starting off a course. Second thing that I want to do is to learn something about the student population as best I can. There's been a lot of research done in the physics community about what students walk into a class knowing. And it's not just physics content. It's, for instance, their epistemology of learning. What do they think it means to learn science? And so reading up on the specifics for the topic that I'm going to be teaching is often incredibly useful to me. So it gives me ideas about places to start the semester with. It gives me ideas about where the students are going to be confident and successful and where they're going to be struggling.
Never in a million years did I ever think I would say this. I think it's very important to teach less better, particularly for the medical students. It's really important to make sure they have a solid foundation of knowledge. And so you need to teach that goes to that foundation, teach information that goes to that foundation, and then constantly come back and revisit it in a different context so that you know that the students are starting to formulate an underlying cognitive understanding of what you've been talking about. So it's not just isolated facts, but they start seeing relationship between facts. They start actually incorporating it into an understanding so that they really know how the brain functions. And so when they're in a novel context, for example, seeing a patient for the first time, no two patients ever present the same. They're not threatened because they have a foundation of knowledge with which to evaluate this individual. And so I go more to foundation material rather than just thousands of isolated, interesting facts.
As you can see there, Professor Norden gradually realised the importance of focusing her teaching on the core skills rather than simply piling up an immense quantity of course content. Here's a few things that you ought to do when you're planning courses, especially if you're doing it as a beginner. It's a good idea to write out 3 or 4 principal objectives of the course and then design all the rest of the individual classes in such a way that they'll contribute to supporting those intended outcomes. Then, having got the general objectives, then break down the material into manageable units. And it's important to remember this, that you as a teacher often have been through many years of study of that material, and you're now so familiar with the material, it's sometimes easy to forget that from the student's point of view, it's all new and alien. You should never be surprised by the materials in your own class, but the students are going to be. For them, it's new. And that means that sometimes a point you can grasp instantly, almost by second nature or by osmosis, often needs to be explained carefully and slowly to people encountering it for the first time, especially if it's coming to them in a conceptually unfamiliar way. Next, of course, you need to sequence the material as logically as you possibly can. Now, sometimes each class depends upon work done in the previous classes. At other times, each one stands alone. The logic of the sequencing will depend very much upon the nature of the content itself, as Professor Scott Page explains here.
Some of the courses that I teach are literally like getting on a train and going from Detroit to Chicago. And I tell them, if you ever fall off, you're done, right? Because, week 7 depends on week 6, and week 8 depends on week 7, and week 9 depends on week 8. There's other courses, like our visit, like this complex systems course, I tell them it's like a visit to the Arboretum. We're going to look at the elm tree, they're going to look at the oak tree, they're going to look at the rhododendra, and they're all of a piece. But if you miss the rhododendra lecture, you'll miss that on the exam, and you won't get the rhododendra, but it's really not going to have a huge impact on the oak.
Now, in my case, as a history teacher, chronology is generally the obvious method. History itself actually presents us with an organizational principle. That is to talk about the 1930s before you talk about the 1940s, and talk about the 40s before the 50s, and so on. In other words, that's very much like Scott's example of the train, where you need to really follow along so that each thing comes in its proper sequence. But occasionally, I, as a history teacher, put aside chronology to adopt a conceptual approach instead. For example, you've already seen some bits of film from my environmental history class. Now, in that one, the period of time being covered was the 1960s through the present. And I decided that it made more sense to organize it by theme. A week on population, a week on pollution, a week on environmental cancer, a week on global warming, and so on. So there, we went through the same number of years each time, but that made much more sense than trying to look at all those themes in the 60s and then all those themes in the 70s and so on. That's a little bit more like Scott's Arboretum approach. A student who missed the pollution week would be weak on the exam but would get the sense of the rest of the course. Now, whatever your organisational principle is, make sure that you let the students know it. Let them know why the course is structured as it is. It'll give them helpful insights into the nature of the material you're teaching. And of course, grasping it conceptually will help them to know what to anticipate from one meeting to the next. If they know what the framework is, they'll see how each part fits. Now, create a space in your planning for review of the material learned so far. And don't be afraid of repetition. Don't be afraid of repetition. Remember, it's familiar to you, but it's new to them, both in its form and in its content. So really, you shouldn't be afraid of repetition. Nearly everyone benefits from it, which helps the students to own the material. Obviously, what you're trying to do is to get the students to feel this material with the same familiarity that you do already. Now, at the end of each class period, it's a good idea to summarise what you've just taught. We've even got research on things like patterns of student learning over the course of an hour. And what researchers have discovered is that students tend to learn most at the beginning of class. So you should say all the important things right up front. And then you should say them again just before the end, as they anticipate a shift and as they get ready to leave. Those are, in fact, the phases when they're most intellectually alert. So these are the times to declare and to repeat your principal themes. Now, new challenges and new points of interest should confront the students at each step. But of course, nothing should take you by surprise. Try to organise your material in such a way and plan your material so that each class will introduce something decisively new which will advance their learning and also catch their interest. Even the most sober subject matter will benefit from the introduction of carefully pre-planned drama. I think, for example, that if you're studying history of science or evolutionary biology, it's a great idea to talk not just about Darwin's ideas, but about the fact that once he'd been to the Galapagos Islands in the 1830s, he then delayed and delayed and delayed as he worked out the details of the theory of evolution. He didn't finally publish On the Origin of Species until 1859, and his friends were becoming increasingly anxious that another very talented scientist, Alfred Russel Wallace, was moving very quickly towards the same idea. So you can create some dramatic tension about which one's going to get the book out first. In the same way, when I'm teaching about World War II, I can generate dramatic tension by talking about Winston Churchill's desperate anxiety to get the Americans to become involved in the Second World War. Between September 1939 and December of 1941, the British were fighting against Hitler and the Americans weren't. And Churchill was constantly working to find a way to get the Americans directly involved. And the students can come to share that sense of tension. Now, as I said at the beginning, you've got to avoid putting yourself in a kind of straitjacket by planning right down to the fine details. There always needs to be some scope in your plan for adapting to contingencies. Let's listen to a couple of students giving us an insight into professors who failed to do that. Professors who, through poor planning probably, had put themselves in those straitjackets.
They don't change their teaching style when they realize that something's not going right.
They had a clear goal in mind when they entered the classroom, and their sole purpose was to achieve that goal. If they were going to cover points A through J during class, they would go in and talk straight A through J and not pay attention and not care if the entire class fell asleep at part B.
Even experienced teachers are sometimes obliged to adapt their courses if students learn faster or more slowly than expected, or if particular opportunities arise. Michael Roberto at Bryant University recalls how, as a beginning teacher, he often prepared far too rigidly, too closely. And then he describes the way in which he gradually learned the need to leave more things to chance. And in the same way, Scott Page talks about how even now, although he's certainly a veteran classroom teacher, he often decides to rewrite the syllabus, reconfigure the material in light of what's happened in the course so far.
I was, incredibly anal about wanting to be prepared, right? Develop these very detailed teaching plans. And that was sort of my training at Harvard Business School. We'd meet every week to talk about what we were teaching, and we'd all have these very detailed teaching plans. But the case method and the Socratic method doesn't work if you have a very rigid plan and then stick to it rigidly. Right? The whole idea is for you to facilitate this dialogue and be willing to work with the students to let them sort of go where they want to go at times, while still keeping them within certain boundaries. We used to call them pastures. You know, you'd go into class and ideally you have these sort of 3 or 4 pastures of discussion. But remember, we've talked about economies of scale and economies of learning. We have one more economy to talk about. And you would want to cover the 4 or 5 pastures. But within those pastures, you got to let the cattle roam a little bit, right? That was the idea. And I didn't let them roam enough. I would sort of have this plan and want to rigidly keep them to it. And, you know, and got some great mentorship from senior faculty who said, you have a great plan, but your reins are too tight.
This year I'm going to make it with only 2 syllabi for the course, which will be a low for me. I mean, typically, like, I'm 5 weeks in and I'm like, we're changing this syllabus. You know, and then at week 10, we change the syllabus again.
Now, if you're teaching art history and a travelling exhibition comes to town bringing in some Rembrandts, it's clearly a good idea to change your plan so that you can take the students to see them. Or if there's a chance to take the students to hear a prominent figure speaking on a relevant topic in literature or in politics. Or if there's a dramatic event that interrupts the everyday life of your community and you're teaching sociology. It's always a good idea to try to find a way to incorporate these events into your course, partly to emphasize the continuity of theory and practice. I mean, for example, when President Obama was inaugurated, I taught the very next day. And I think it would have been obtuse of me not to spend some time talking about comparative presidential inaugurations, because I was teaching a course on the Intro to US History in any case, and this was a wonderful event, which is itself about to become part of the permanent historical record. Effective teachers always think ahead, and they design courses with a sure sense of what they want and why they want it. They also leave room for unexpected learning opportunities. Now, this leads me on to another critical point which you need to think about when planning. Beware of trying to cram too much material into each class. Beginning teachers are particularly susceptible to this error. They have a dread of suddenly drying up halfway through class and having nothing left to say. So they tend to squeeze in more and more material, or else they do it because they think, well, there's such a lot to cover. I'm teaching the whole 20th century. I've got to really pack it in. Now, this is one of my own characteristic weaknesses. I also tend to put in too much material. In a clip of film a few minutes ago, we saw Jeanette Norden describing her gradual realization that it's sometimes better to cover less material, but of course, to cover it better. Think about it this way. There's absolutely no value at all in covering everything if the students are then unable to retain it. There's no point in our saying these things if it simply just goes straight through them. Here's Dr. Norden again, elaborating on that point.
The very first year I talked about an area of the brain called the reticular formation. And the reticular formation is about the size of my little finger, but in that are like 110 different groups of cells that control every vital function in your body. So they control your ability to breathe, your heart rate, all these really important things. Well, the very first year I taught medical students about the reticular formation, I thought it was important that they knew the names of all 110 nuclei and everything I knew about these 110 nuclei. And I thought this was just fascinating, how this little tiny area of the brain is what keeps us alive and allows our heart to be all these important things. Well, I gave the lecture and it fell completely flat. The students were basically just staring at me. So I went back to my office and I thought, what could I have done wrong? And so the next year, not having learned from my experience, the next year I went in and I gave the exact same lecture again, but I brought even more enthusiasm to the subject. And I thought, surely that was what was wrong. Well, all the students were staring at me again like the deer in the headlights. So the second year, I went back to my office and I put my notes on my desk, and I realized that 99% of what I had told the students wasn't even information that they needed to know. What medical students needed to understand was if you compromised this tiny area of the brain, that your patient could die, and why that was true.
One of the most important things about planning is trying to anticipate which aspects of the course the students are going to find the most difficult, and then making plans to meet those difficulties. It's important and it's difficult, but it's also necessary to get into the frame of mind of people who find difficult what you find easy. Think about it this way. In a way, there's something to be said for teachers all teaching the subjects that they were worst at school. Because I'm sure you all have the horrible memory of things that you just couldn't get, that sinking feeling, I simply can't understand it. Now, when eventually you have come to understand it, you've got a very, very sure sense of what it feels like to be somebody who can't. And so, in a way, if we were teaching subjects like that, we'd have that much more empathy with our students. On the other hand, of course, there'd be some offsetting disadvantages, which is probably why we haven't adopted that method. I don't think anything would induce me to be a math teacher. Now, one excellent way of getting into the student's frame of mind is to become a student again, so as to remember exactly what it's like. And it's especially useful now and again to take a course that's far outside of your comfort area. I've already said in the course and emphasized strongly something I'm going to say repeatedly. We're looking for ways to become lifelong learners, and that's certainly what all teachers should be. But actually taking a course in a very formal way is a particular challenge in this respect. I spent a very illuminating and entertaining summer in Spain doing an intensive Spanish language course, having previously never studied any Spanish at all. Emory University, where I work, was very eager to develop a global outlook among its students. And then the Spanish department said, well, that means we've got to have a global outlook among our faculty as well. And they actually persuaded the administration to pay for faculty members to go to Salamanca, this lovely old walled medieval city in northwestern Spain, to study Spanish intensively. And I was one of them. Anyway, it was a humbling experience, because I was one of the very worst in the class. And I witnessed at first hand my own extreme slowness in catching on to things that seemed just painfully obvious to the teacher herself. Now, since we were in Spain, I had an extremely high incentive to become proficient. But even so, it was just agonizingly slow. And meanwhile, if I had to go shopping, I was like the village idiot when I went to the store. I'd just go in with my phrase book and I'd have one noun and I'd blurt out the noun to the shopkeepers who thought it was vastly amusing, because I simply wasn't capable of speaking in complete sentences. Now, the benefit of that experience was to give me a very vivid sense of what it's like to be a student who's struggling. And I do think it's increased my empathy for students in trouble. That doesn't mean I always treat them kindly. Sometimes I'm very hard on them. But nevertheless, I'm aware of what they might be going through. Outstanding teachers are always thinking about how their work looks from the student's point of view. And that's going to be the theme of another lecture. Because ideally, students and teachers should be invested in each other's success. Students often feel as though there's an adversarial relationship between teacher and student, whereas actually, teachers, or good ones anyway, want the students to succeed. Of course, the students appreciate careful planning on their teacher's part. They're keenly aware of when the teachers have planned properly and when they haven't, as we'll see from these students.
He would get up and he would sort of begin to talk, and you wouldn't really have a set goal. There would be no notes for you to refer to, and there wasn't a set agenda. So when you walked in, you didn't know what you were going to walk out with, and along the way you're sort of grabbing at straws to try to figure out what's relevant and what's not.
The whole class was just disorganized, confusing, random. None of the material taught in the class matched the textbook, so it's very difficult for me to go back and review for exams and quizzes.
Overly scatterbrained, I guess, when they're missing materials, they come to class unprepared because I don't know, it reflects poorly on the teacher, I think, and it shows that they're not really focused on the class.
Now, it's important to remember that you never get the class that you want. You never teach the class you want. What you've got to do is teach the class you actually get. Wherever you work, and whatever the nature of your teaching work, you'll gradually become familiar with the type of students you're likely to get, and their characteristic strengths and weaknesses. And your job, obviously, is to tailor your planning around your knowledge of what they're going to be like. Set goals for yourself, and set goals for the students, and communicate them clearly right from the beginning. It's also necessary before the beginning to decide how you're going to evaluate the course. Again, this is a point I want to stress. Before the course begins, you need to think about what's going to happen by the time it's ended, and you should be ready with that all the time. Your plan, your syllabus, should be long enough to show the students what they'll be doing in each class, but shouldn't be too long so that they feel overpowered with details. The plan should include the number of papers they're going to have to write, the amount of homework they're going to have to do from week to week, the dates when assignments are due, the dates when the exams are going to be held, so you can cut down ambiguities to the absolute minimum. Now, this sort of information is usually provided in college on a printed syllabus, but any teacher or any coach or any business training professional will find it very, very helpful to provide their team or their students or their employees with a lesson plan or a practice plan. The plan should inform the students of the number of meetings, the dates, the times, the places, cutting down on ambiguity in every way and showing here's what we plan for each of the meetings that's going to ensue. The same guidelines apply in all teaching situations. Address issues such as encouraging interest and commitment, develop foundational skills, sequence the material logically. You need to set realistic goals for meetings or for practices, leave time for review, don't be afraid of repetition, anticipate difficulties, and set goals for yourself and for the student or team members. Now, another thing that you're going to have to do when the course ends is grade everybody. And that means that you need to plan in such a way that you've created a structure which will enable you to distinguish between the best students, the ones in the middle, and the weaker ones. There are many situations where you've got to give grades of some sort, and then, of course, there are other situations, other teaching environments, where less formal feedback and evaluation are necessary. But in all cases, you should have in mind some way of ascertaining the degree to which the students have mastered what you had to teach. Because you can evaluate, in doing that, you can evaluate not only them, but also yourself. If nobody has really mastered the material by the end of the course, that's a reflection on you as much as it's a reflection on the students. And again, gradually, you should be able to bring into sharp focus the degree to which your aspirations are realistic. Now, of course, you're aiming to teach them all to a very, very high standard. You want them all to succeed. But the vagaries of human nature make it inevitable that some will excel, others will manage more or less well, and a few of them will really struggle. And then there are always going to be, or almost always, there are going to be others who are simply uninterested or they're distracted, something else is going on in their lives, through no fault of your own. Your system of evaluation must be designed to reflect these differences accurately. Grading is an issue to which we'll return much later in the course, where I shall have a lecture devoted to it. But it is something you need to be thinking about as you're planning right from the outset. So set goals for yourself with the idea of correcting what you know to be your own weaknesses. I know, for example, that I tend to talk too fast. My parents were onto me about this from a very early age. And I know that in planning lectures, I tend to cram in too much material, especially when I'm teaching lecture courses which cover several centuries. In a recent semester, I resolved simply to slow down my lectures and to simplify them, in effect following Dr. Norden's advice about the importance of teaching less, better. I once asked a student, a very confident kid, to be the too fast monitor, and his job was to wave. Every time I started speaking too fast, he would wave, and that would have the effect of making me slow down. And of course, my knowledge that he was there and that he was going to do it made it more likely that I wouldn't speak too fast. And gradually, the waving died out. We'd be deceiving ourselves if we thought we'd achieved perfection. Good teachers of all kinds continue to worry about improving throughout their careers. All right, so now summing up, what can we take? What ideas can we take from this lecture? First of all, planning is essential for success in any teaching venture. In the classroom, in athletic coaching, in business training, you've always got to know exactly what you're going to do. You must set goals for yourself and for your students and know what you hope to achieve by the end before you begin. You need to break the material down into manageable units. You need to sequence them logically and be ready to justify the nature of the sequence you've created. You need to leave time for review and repetition. You should never be afraid of repetition. Don't plan too many details, but allow some room for flexibility, and then to take advantage of unforeseen learning opportunities and unforeseen difficulties which will still arise. Don't try to cram too much material into each meeting. It's better for students to understand the material than to have more material thrown at them than they can realistically comprehend. You need to anticipate where your students will struggle and plan for it. Now, in the next lecture, we're going to be looking at some of these general issues from the student's point of view, or at least from the professor's idea of the student's point of view, which may not exactly be the same thing.